Last week we heard weapon shipments would be paused to Ukraine. Well, a few days ago, Donald Trump said, that's weird. I haven't heard anything about that. I'm going to send more weapons to Ukraine because they've been hit very hard. Donald Trump in an interview said, we're at questions during his presser, says, Putin has been very difficult to deal with. He talks a lot. He acts nice, but you just can't get anything done. Something to know, by the way, about Putin is Putin will regularly release these statements about how Trump was right and how Trump is so great compared to Biden. And Trump is also correct in saying that the war would have never happened if Trump were president. Putin is playing so far Trump like a fiddle. It's like elevate Trump's ego. Putin knows how to get to Trump. But Trump is waking up. He's realizing, all right, we're getting played here. And so now the Trump administration is not only considering sending more weapons to Ukraine, including new Patriot missile batteries for air defense, but we're seeing a potential sanctions bill that could have implications for the market. And so that's what we want to talk about. So in Congress now, in the Senate, there's a bill that could be voted on in the last sort of probably 2 weeks of this month, probably last week even of this month. So mark your calendar for that, sort of now to August 1st period. Tomorrow's 7/11, so we're in about 20-ish days left in the month. So about 3 weeks left in the month. In the last week, 10 days of the month, we could end up seeing the Senate vote for a sanctions bill against Russia. Now, why could that have market implications? Well, potentially because of the tariffs it would impose on China and India. Now, mind you, we've been talking about a better trade deal with China forever, since day one of liberation. And so far, we've only come up with a rough framework and these guardrails that say Chinese tariffs are 55%, including their prior tariffs. That's a very high level. We don't actually have a deal with the Chinese on broader, more permanent measures. In fact, the Chinese have given us a 6-month countdown timer for what period of times they would be willing to supply us rare earth minerals in. So in other words, that clock is ticking. At the same time as that clock is ticking with China, the United States is like, well, fine then. We'll invest 15, whatever. I can't remember exactly what they invested, but they just, they took 15% ownership of MP Materials. So our government, Donald Trump is like, MP's about to rocket like a moon. We want it, or rocket, or moon like a rocket, I guess would be the way to say it. MP's going to the moon, so we're going to buy 15% of the company. And then we're going to buy all of the rare earths that we want from them at a minimum floor price. All that really a topic for a different video. But if you connect it to negotiations that are going on broadly and you connect all these dots, you can see what Trump is doing. He's trying to send a really loud signal to China that, hey, we'll do our own rare earths. Now, between you and me, it's going to take years for MP Material to actually build out these facilities and get to where they can hold a candle to what China is doing. But you can see all of this has to do with tariffs. This MP Material deal, tariffs. There's, these sanctions on Russia, potentially threatening that if the Chinese and the Indians or the Iranians, or North Koreans to some extent, basically the Axis, buy oil from Russia, then Donald Trump will institute, quote, 500% tariffs on their products. So basically all trade if they buy Russian oil. Okay, now that obviously becomes very challenging to get to the bottom of because Russian oil is not usually transported on ships with Russian flags. They usually transship the oil through, other country flags. They try to deceive and, confuse trackers, but we can tell when it's happening. And we know, we know China is buying Russian oil, and the oil markets are really what are propping up Russia's ability to keep funding this war in Ukraine. They really have an oil and wartime economy. The war is actually increasing gross domestic product in Russia. Of course, you're just lighting it all on fire in a war in Ukraine. And then, of course, oil is also funding the balance sheet of the Russian government. So This is Donald Trump's point of view that maybe this is what we need to do. And so what you're finding is Democrats are now coming out and saying Donald Trump is finally realizing that Putin has been playing the president for months, and we're currently no closer to a peace deal than he promised on day one of his presidency. In fairness, they're right. Donald Trump has tried his best to get a deal going. In fact, I think this tweet puts a good summary together. What Donald Trump has done for Russia in 2025, lifted sanctions on arms dealers, Kremlin-linked banks. Some of this is a little like hyperbolic. Disbanded U.S. sanctions enforcement, blocked Ukrainian aid approved by Congress, opposed oil price caps at G7. Basically this idea of Trump has been trying to remove restrictions on China, but that's been part of Trump's ability to negotiate, or his desire to negotiate. He's been trying to attract Putin with honey, and it's just not working. Putin apparently only knows piss and vinegar. And I think that is where Donald Trump is now recognizing, all right, we're probably going to green light this bill that's in Congress. And this bill that's in Congress is essentially a bill that would give Donald Trump a lot of optionality with Russia. So, top Republican congressional leaders said Wednesday they are prepared to move forward with new sanctions targeting Russia this month after Donald Trump signaled he's willing to pressure Moscow to end the war in Ukraine. Putin is showing an unwillingness to be reasonable and to talk seriously about brokering peace, and I think we have to send them a message. That's my view, Speaker Mike Johnson. Now, Mike Johnson basically does whatever Trump wants. So does the Supreme Court. Okay, sorry, that's a topic for a different video. But Mike Johnson, whatever Trump ultimately rallies behind is going to be what the speaker's going to push for, because it's the easiest way to help members of Congress reaffirm that their seats are secure through a presidential endorsement or funding from, MAGA associated Republicans. So Thune is going to do, Johnson is going to do what President Trump wants. Now, on top of this, you've got John Thune suggesting that there has been substantial progress in working with the White House on this bill that would enhance President Trump's leverage at the negotiation table. Now, Lindsey Graham is drafting this bill in part, and the bill includes the ability for Donald Trump to waive new sanctions against Russia if a ceasefire deal is reached for 180 days plus potentially a second 180 days. So in other words, it kind of gives Trump this like, hey, Congress is going to impose all these crazy sanctions on Russia, which could potentially affect Russia or affect India and China if they buy oil from Russia. However, Trump, if you negotiate a ceasefire, we're able to include a 180-day pause in here. So expect some volatility potentially in markets towards the end of the month, which usually geopolitical issues are buy the dip opportunity. But I think that all of this is going to link back to tariffs, where this 180-day potential waiver ends up being a 6-month pause on these 500% tariffs in the future, but just be aware of what's going on. Bottom line, Trump is essentially losing his peaceful negotiation with Putin. It's not working. As a result, he's now thinking about having an optional bill, which basically gives Trump options. And Trump says he is, quote, good with the latest draft, which would allow Trump to severely ramp up pressure on Putin. Now, is Putin going to care about sanctions? Who knows? But Putin is going to care about losing potential oil revenue from China and India. And that's why they're threatening the 500% oil tariffs. That's a really big deal because it's not 500% on just oil. It's if you buy oil from Russia, it's 500% on everything. So in other words, tariffs on China could 10x unless they stop buying oil. They stop buying oil, Putin goes, oh, maybe his back gets against, is pushed against a wall. And this is where people then raise the question of, is Putin going to lash out against Ukraine? Could we see more pressure rather than less? Which is also why Trump is now wanting to send more defensive weapons, quote, mostly defensive weapons, Donald Trump says, to Ukraine. See how it's all getting set up? Being nice to Putin wasn't working. Now we're going to send more equipment to Ukraine, especially defensive weaponry. Then we're going to sanction Russia even more. Then we're going to piss off the Chinese and Indians by looping them in on this. And we're going to try to push or pressure Putin to basically end this war. which could obviously spill over into more attacks from Russia or more tariff concerns. But Donald Trump's already built in his famous taco, the 180-day pause, potentially 2 of them. So, now, under what conditions you would be able to pause? TBD all of the details. But if you start kind of linking all these pieces together, you can see how all of this is part of Trump's policy, and it gives you, I think, a nice breakdown of what's going on and, you know, how tariffs could be quite volatile over the next few months. All right, what else? Oh, and if any of this makes you nervous, get life insurance in as little as 5 minutes by going to metkevin.com/life. Paid sponsor of the channel, metkevin.com/life. And you can get life insurance in as little as 5 minutes. Check them out.
Why not advertise these things that you told us here? I feel like nobody else knows about this.
We'll try a little advertising and see how it goes.
Congratulations, man. You have done so much. People love you. People look up to you.
Kevin Paffrath there, financial analyst and YouTuber. Meet Kevin. Always great to get your take.